afternoon, good evening, good morning, everybody, wherever you are. Welcome to the webinar, Place is Not an Afterthought, the Missing Piece in Effective Strategies and Evaluation. Place-based grant making is not the same thing as making grants in a place. Something that my friend William Buster said once that left a profound impact on me. And it really made me continuously think about, what does place mean? And what about a place makes it unique? And what do you have to consider in your strategies and evaluation when you work in a place? That led to this webinar because over the years of evaluating place-based work, I frequently hear people talk about place as it's just a context, that it influences the outcomes. Not always that there are outcomes in the place in of itself. And so I decided to gather my two colleagues, Amber Trout and Corianne Skelly, to have this webinar to have us talk a little bit about what does place mean in our work. So today's takeaways are three things. Next slide, please. Understanding place is more than a contextual variable. Key things about a place to pay close attention to. There's a lot of them, but there are a few that we find over and over again are important to really pay close attention to. And tools to support understanding and measuring change in place. Again, there are many, many tools, and we're just going to share a couple of them here on this webinar. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, I'm here today with my wonderful colleagues, Corianne Skelly and Amber Trout, both principal associates at Community Science. We are a small business here, headquartered in Maryland. These are our wonderful people. And we work with governments, foundations, and nonprofit organizations on solutions to social problems through community and other systems changes. This webinar is brought to you by the Equitable Community Development Practice Area at Community Science. Our Equitable Community Development Practice Area places importance of where people live, from the smallest towns to the largest cities, and what is accessible to them in that place. We find that what's accessible are shaped by decades of policies, practices, and narratives that help some communities thrive while harming others. At Community Science, our Equitable Community Development Practice aims to transform systems and ensure fair access to opportunities and resources for all people, especially those who have historically faced biases that limited their access. We study and generate evidence-based policies and practices that remove systemic barriers, mobilize the collective strengths of the people, like their culture and their creativities, social connectedness, entrepreneurship and innovation, and their grit, and center community voices in the solutions. We're going to start with a story, and then Corianne will share her story, and Amber will share hers last, about a place. I will start with this place that I encountered and worked in, where historically it was that early French Canadian settlers worked there. They settled there to work in the paper mills and factories and emerge over time as the political and economic power brokers. This community had a large mural that depicts the history and story of the early French Canadian settlers, which also meant that the recent newcomers were not illustrated in this mural. And it was a constant reminder every day that they were not the settlers of this place. There's also a geographic divide in this community that separates the upper and lower parts of the neighborhood. And it was literally a hill. The economic forces in this community changed over the years, from the time when it was a thriving paper mill town with a lot of manufacturing, to then major economic decline over time. And this economic decline coincided with what the community observed as an influx of newcomers, primarily Blacks and Latino families, into the community. As such, narratives created where the neighborhood residents in the upper side of the hill, or on the higher side of the hill, on top of the hill, perceive that those who live in the lower part, which were occupied primarily by Latino families, as dangerous and dirty. And the neighborhood residents, primarily the Latino families who lived in the lower part of the hill, at the bottom of the hill, did not feel welcomed in the upper side of the hill, right, which was occupied by descendants of the French Canadian settlers and Black families of higher socioeconomic status. So what was the strategy that was taken to create the sense of community? Primarily a community organizing strategy. A community organizer went door knocking on the doors of residents, both in the upper and lower side of the neighborhood, to really identify what were their concerns. And there were lots of concerns. Two of these really floated up to the top. There was a lack of sidewalks. And it forced children to walk to school on the streets or wait for their school bus on the street. And parents, no matter where they lived, on the upper side, lower side, what their socioeconomic status was, what their racial background was, they were concerned for their children's safety. There were also no speed bumps or stop signs to help enforce speed limit, which also, again, they felt was a danger to their students, their children's safety. So what they did was they brought people together with perceived differences to exchange their stories and use interpretation assistance to allow residents who are monolingual Spanish-speaking, monolingual Spanish-speaking families, allow them to be able to connect and to exchange their stories with English-speaking residents and vice versa. These connections and these common concerns that encourage the residents to share their issues with the local elected officials. And at the same time, there was technical assistance to help build the leadership capacity to bridge and build community here. The accomplishments were great. So in a year, the community, next slide, please. In a year, this community was able to achieve some great things. The police department established a rotating detail, stationed a police officer at different bus stops on each day of the week. There were new sidewalks that were actually built on two streets where children had to walk to schools. These streets were also given increased lighting. Latino families were actually introduced to and welcomed in a traditional American civic institution that they had never stepped foot into. And the perception that the local community center, which was actually located at the bottom of the hill, the perception that because it was located at the bottom of the hill and therefore served only Latino families, shifted to actually serving all residents. So one of the takeaways from this experience is the importance of conducting an annual community capacity assessment. This community succeeded because it had strong community organizing abilities. There was a team of people there who were from the community, who were trained community organizers, who were able to go and make those connections. So the community capacity assessment is something that community science has done. And what it means is that you're really assessing the organization's ability to perform functions that are essential for place-based change. So the organizations that reside in that community and that support that community or that place can be assessed on their ability to do things like bridging across differences, community organizing, community outreach and engagement, advocacy, and cross-sector collaboration. The measure is actually a very simple one. There's a set of 6 responses that are used in the assessment. They are, we don't know how to do this at all. So if let's say it's community organizing, the answer is we don't know how to do community organizing at all. We've started to develop some skills in community organizing. We're doing okay, but we can do better. We're able to do it really well. We know everything we need to know and can actually teach others, or that this capacity is actually not applicable to our needs or what we're trying to do. And you can then score these different capacities and then come up with a composite score by capacity and overall. And what you see in this quick chart here is just that there is a cohort of organizations that we could kind of be the standard for that whole, for all the measures, and then you have the measure of different organizations. And then you could do it, over time annually to see if those capacities improved or changed or declined over time. So this is something that we've done, and this is a key takeaway for the type of place-based change we've been evaluating in terms of being able to assess really community readiness in many ways. And that's the end of story A. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Corianne to begin story B.
Thanks so much, Kian. Hi, everyone. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to lead a process and evaluation process and outcomes evaluation of the construction of a tiny homes community in Bozeman, Montana. The community was developed to serve as permanent supportive rental housing for individuals and families in the community who are experiencing homelessness and other challenges. And so today I'm going to walk through some of the salient characteristics of the city and how it affected the outcomes for that project's process and development. So first was natural resources. As Kian has already described, understanding what people value most about their community is critical. And in Bozeman, it's often the mountains, and it's the ability to see and experience the mountains from where you live. And this ends up then being reflected in the local zoning and land use restrictions that help optimize views and keep buildings low and spread out so that everyone can enjoy the space. Another important part of the place is the availability and cost of land for the purposes of this land and property development project. Despite what looks like a visible abundance of land, there's actually not much available for development. Most of the land is actually already developed, is being held for other purposes, often by large anchor institutions such as a hospital and university in town, or is lacking easy access to infrastructure that really supports development. So high competition for the remaining properties has driven up prices over time. Bozeman had also recently completed a housing needs assessment showing the need for new housing in the community. Prior to our engagement in this work. And in this housing plan, the city had acknowledged that some of the new housing that was needed in the community should target folks with the lowest incomes, including those who were experiencing homelessness in the community. And this acknowledgement by the city helped open the door for the community to consider expanding its housing supply to meet the needs of this marginalized population, and also open the door to tiny home development. And finally, the narratives, of course, that were circulating in place were important to understand and work within. There were assumptions in the local community that people with low incomes were not working and that they were not working by choice, when the reality was that usually they were working if they could. There were also strong perceptions that people experiencing homelessness in the community were not actually from the city and were not working. But the experiences of the service providers in the city serving these individuals and families showed that they had often been in the community for multiple years, and many were working and simply could not afford the rental housing available in town. So, project stakeholders used many strategies to foster community ownership around building a tiny home village. Um, Next slide, please. First, a trusted lead organization, the local community action agency and homeless services provider, helped bring partners together to support the tiny home village in multiple ways. Second, the lead organization met individually with neighboring property owners of the site that they purchased for the tiny homes community. They brought together a working group to strategize around messaging to the broader public and not just those in the community who already supported the project. And finally, they also prioritize community ownership of the development through engaging volunteers in project fundraising and actually in constructing some of the homes to help really boost civic pride and engagement in the work. And last but not least, when certain types of development are not explicitly allowed in the current zoning code, you need updates to help make those explicitly available. So the lead organization worked with the city planning division to update zoning regulations and processes to allow shelters and permanent supportive housing in more zones, and also to allow tiny homes, which are a very unique type of housing. And this helped alleviate requirements for community review by allowing this development as of right. And it also minimized the channels available for community opposition to the tiny homes. In terms of accomplishments, we see by the picture on the next slide that at the end of our study period, there were 12 beautiful tiny homes constructed and completed, and there were 7 more in progress with volunteer help. The first homes were also successfully leased to individuals and families experiencing homelessness in the community, and they had the ability to access wraparound services to support their needs. And while you'll notice that these homes were located in a commercial district rather than a strictly residential one, this did mean that the village was close to public transportation and jobs in the community where cars are often needed to get around. In terms of takeaways and tips, building community takes time, trust, and collaboration. Project planning across the diverse group of partners took 5 years before construction started. While it's always nice for things to go more quickly, it's certainly important to balance that with the needs to build the collaboration that you really need to get the work done well for a community. Tailored and sustained communications is key to narrative change. Um, and narrative change requires taking people's concerns seriously and engaging in consistent and authentic dialogue. This is especially true in small communities where connections extend far beyond professional working relationships to include running into one another at the grocery store, sharing religious services together, showing up at the same school functions, and the like. Engaging community residents directly in solutions helps them to buy in. Local groups can tap into positive community energy by inviting people to show up physically on site in this case, and really give their time and their energy to be a direct participant in building and implementing community solutions and not just a passive observer. In this case, and I think in many cases, an external learning partner provides space for honest feedback um, and for promoting uh, just in time strategy improvements while the process is still working itself out. Coming in from the outside allowed people to talk to our team in confidence during the interviews that we conducted and express any concerns as well as excitements that they had about the project's progress. And we were able to thoughtfully aggregate the concerns in a way that did not call out individuals, but gave important feedback to the lead organization and helped them strengthen their communication strategy mid project, which really improved, I think, the sense of community around the project over time. And finally, community building and change is possible even when not everyone agrees or is on board. The goal for this project from the beginning was to provide critical housing and services for marginalized members of the community that the data showed needed this type of help. And to do so in a way that could draw the most community support and the least opposition. So, moving forward with the project did not require all almost 50,000 residents of the city to agree with the exact plan, but responding to community concerns and listening to those, as well as previous backlash against planned housing for homeless individuals and families, did lead to some important project adjustments, such as building in a more commercial area rather than a strictly residential one. But this still met the project goals and yielded a successful community outcome. And with that, I will turn things over to Amber.
And good people, I see your Q&A, and so you got one more story to listen to, but Ken and Coriana tell you, maybe click on that. There's some detailed follow-ups that I think will be good for conversation after this story.
Before you go, Amber, I think maybe Corianne can answer this real quick because there's a question about where this project took place and the tiny homes.
That's right.
Yes, it was in Bozeman, Montana, and the homes were I should say we finished our work in 2021, and the first 12 units were completed and leased up at that time.
Thank you. Back to you, Amber.
That's right. So I'm bringing some community stories about community leaders from North Dakota and South Dakota and the 23 Native nations that share that same geography. And this story talks about what's a leader, who's a leader, who gets to be a leader, and really understanding the histories of the region of why there's one definition of a leader, which was the hero that does it all. But we know that's not true. And at the same time, understanding that there's a growing, the political climate where there's widening disparities, there's growing frustrations, and to be honest, just feeling like a forgotten region, hearing phrases like the flyover or we're only of interest when there's an election. So the community is feeling misunderstood. So how do you use a leadership development program across vast geographies? Well, that was the question of this leadership development program called Change Network. And how do you use a cohort model to connect people across towns and regions to build that sense of community when perhaps it feels like there's a vastness and you're alone when you want to see or make change in your community. And also really thinking about who is a leader. I'm a leader. So when I go to the next slide, it's really assuming all of these leaders didn't come to this program to become leaders. They were already leaders. But what we know to be true and want to debunk is one person can't do change. And so here is how do you take people that feel isolated and give a chance to work with other people in different communities and towns and tap into each other's networks and build momentum there. And what we learned is really how do you use the opportunity to connect, not to jump straight to systems. And we know it's not a straight through path. So on the next slide is really where I'm going to sit a lot. So how do you go from I'm alone to the collective we? And that really, most of the key findings that I'm sharing today is in our report called from developing this program, but you'll see it's an infinity sign on purpose. And when I'm talking about this program, I'm not just talking about the community leaders. I'm talking about the program implementers, the evaluators, and the funders. We were the outside group coming in as the evaluators. And what we've learned to be true and learned from the communities, it takes a long time to be trusted in rural communities and vast geographies. So first, we all had to learn how to work together. So I'm on that left-hand side up here. And how do you learn to be in space together? Who owns the data? What does evaluation mean? How has evaluation been used in different communities? How is it used to be extracted? So then once we talk that through, and then you start building, how do we meaningfully engage in each other? So there's the program that was providing opportunities for community leaders to learn how to identify with their own, how do they lead? That one, you have a culture, right? Some of the community leaders didn't realize they had a culture, and it was an opportunity to be like, yes, I do. And then think about how does that influence how I interact with people? And the one assumption here is people forgetting that everyone's had access to professional development. That's not true, right? Especially when you're talking about community change. You have fear, you're afraid of saying the wrong thing. What if it's politically incorrect? And now I can't go to the one church or the grocery store because I've just othered myself from the community. So having this cohort model also helps not only the evaluator say what is meaningful to you, but how do we engage with people that might seem similar or different to the perspectives and values that we hold. So then that's the insight. That's why you see the light. But that's not where it stops. In this space is how do you work together? How do you listen to each other? I might approach the solution way different than Corianne than Kian, but does that mean they're wrong and I close my ears? No, right? It means tell me a little bit more. But what we learned is it requires a deep empathy, which is why you see the unlocked heart. If I don't feel seen and you don't feel seen, we don't feel seen to see each other and be willing to take action. And so here we are really calling it a deep empathy because you understood someone's lived experience so much that you were willing to take a change. well, what does this mean with place? Well, if this was the goal, we had to think about what's the best way to use a pathway of change, which is the next slide, to really think about what does change look like in place when it's going to be incremental and small. And so we co-created this theory of change with the community leaders, with the program implementers, and the funder to really understand what does it take. And the reason why we use imagery is because every story and everyone's experience is going to be different, but the end is how do you feel connected? So the first part with fertilization really is who am I and how do I lead? And then how do I practice through a project with others and get feedback? So I'm budding and I'm trying things out so much that I'm pollinizing, and now I'm reaching for a leader that has expertise. And here in the pollination, we saw someone write a book, and then they were connected with a leader that was a librarian that did reading time. And so those are little changes that you could say, so what? What does that mean? Well, you're watching the ripple as you're collecting these stories and watching the we. So then the proliferation goes like, well, that went pretty good. What else needs to happen in the community? And here is where the deepened empathy comes into play. We saw in the leadership cohort model is what works for Amber may not work for Corianne or for Kian. So what works when I put a mural? Don't just stop there. That's an output. What's the outcome we're hoping? And this is where we saw and learned from our rural experts saying an investment in a rural place looks a lot different than an urban place. And a mural means community building and a place to come together, and not to underestimate what that means. And it's an opportunity then, after the proliferation of projects, to have deep rooted, so these leaders can reach for each other and not feel alone. Some felt that they were the only person that was looking for opportunity, so everyone in the community could get good food, read the books that they want, or have access to healthcare. And so knowing that there's other peoples in this vast geography that you've met with, you've learned about their cultures right there, a phone call away, a text away, really helped create this rooted system. And the reason why there's a bridge is we're at the end. This has been in I don't know, 6 or 7 years, where how do you bridge people that may not have been in the cohort program? But there's a tipping point in all these communities of a lot of change navigators that are saying, hey, we can do something. And so you have this theory of change collecting data following the ripple. So what does that look like? Well, let me show you on the next slide. We realized we had to get out of the way as the evaluators. How was data collection, the community leaders interviewing themselves over time? And so that we would start at the beginning and the end of a program. It was about a year, and then there was always an alumni event. So then you had a chance to see everyone. And what here is ripple effect mapping. A lot of you mentioned, how do you document the small changes? How do I say they matter? Well, we had that same struggle the first couple of years, and this is what really helped us, is when the leaders interviewed each other, they saw each other's own leaderships, they felt valued, and then started connecting the dots, how they could work together. Not only changing how we interact with people made for more robust conversation, we were able to, advocate for, a couple people started a business together or realized what different resources. So every year we added the ripple further and further. So when we went to communicate back to the funder, or if someone wanted to communicate to their local newspaper or their communities, they're able to say, here's the change we're able to do. So this was not only a leadership development program that focused on the interpersonal, it was connected to the place system the whole time. But it was making sure that it was an evaluation that made sense to the context, and because of the vast geographies, how could people see their stories, and how are they the data collection and the storytellers that they could then feel confident. We even have folks run for education positions, state positions. So, and it links to these critical conversations. So the takeaway here is really, how do you help people see the change? Because when you're in the middle of a change, you don't understand, you may not see how significant it is to you and others to keep moving forward. And so that's what we wanted to share with, how does leadership connect to place, connect to community building and sense of belonging.
Thanks, Amber. So between Amber, Corey, and myself, I mean, our stories have really lifted up certain things about a place that needs close attention, and they include history. What is history? really think about what a history of a place are those significant past events that that shape the political, economic, and cultural conditions of a place. And what we have to remember about history, a lesson that we learned from an evaluation we did, is that that impact of those past events, and that those past events can be, I don't know, 3 months ago. It can be a whole generation ago. But these past events can be felt, right? The impact can be felt by generations of families and newcomers even today. And sometimes they're felt implicitly, or sometimes they're felt very brashly, and it can be very disruptive to the daily lives of the people. Narratives, we all talked about narratives, and narratives must be shifted. And one of the things we learn here is that local media plays a critical role. So, when we talk about how, and I think there's a question about how do you shift narratives? It's hard. It doesn't happen overnight. I remember attending a workshop, and the speakers talk about how it takes years and years sometimes to even change narratives. And you have to figure out, like, how do you start with those influences in the community? Where is that influential voice that can help shift that narrative? Voices of different groups of people in the place must be engaged and listened to. I don't think this is a surprise to anybody, but it's always easier said than done. Sometimes these different groups of people have conflicting perceptions and experiences. So how do you create space to hear from these folks as a group and then together sometimes? But if you're going to bring them together, one of the capacities that's essential is the ability to manage and transform that conflict. Because otherwise the bad experience of coming together will make people not want to come to the table ever again. And so that's a very critical capacity to have. Funders must be self-aware also of how they're perceived in different places. In some places, they're very welcome. In some places, the history of their funding maybe have had left people with a bad experience. And so even if the funder came in and changed the initiative name, or it's a different set of staff, that experience can still be in that community, and therefore the perception can be negative or positive. Factors associated with economic changes must be thoroughly examined. I mean, these economic changes, people often look for a scapegoat. And unfortunately, newcomers to a place are often seen as the reason for why the economic changed. The economic went bad or went sour. And so again, understanding that and being prepared for that is really important. Geography determines division, collaboration, reach, and investment. If a community, a place is really sparse and very wide, sometimes it can take people hours to drive from one side of the place to the other side of the place. How do you make sure that's built into the strategy, the time that's needed? Or sometimes there are physical divides, like in my story, where there's a physical divide that is so literal. Like, how do you actually help people understand that divide, which coincides with the have and have nots and where they live, need to be shifted and thought differently. I think Korean's story really pointed out to political and policy landscape must be assessed and monitored as people make decisions based on their political affiliations of the time on what's needed, and leadership. Leadership plays an important role in being able to shift some of these policies. Next slide, please. With regards to evaluation, I mean, there are so many ways to evaluate place-based change. Cross-case study is one of them. But some of the things that we've really learned over the years is that the conditions of a place should be monitored, and they can be monitored for two reasons. One is you want to change the conditions, so their outcomes. At the same time, the contextual variables that affected the outcomes. And so it's really important to tease that out and to understand, when is it an outcome? When is it that something that affected the outcome? And it's not clean. So it's not always like, it's not something that you can say A led to B, but it's really looking at contributions and what led to the outcome, and how the outcome also affected the context. Community capacity to affect change can be assessed and monitored in quick and simple ways, like I mentioned. I think there's a question that I'm going to answer quickly in the chat that talked about how, what are successful methods used for collecting inputs for community capacity? One of the things we did was we had organizations in a place identified. Who are those key organizations in a place that play a real role in changing the conditions of the place? And then you contact the organizations and you have the organizations complete the assessment. Ideally, the assessment is not completed by one person from the organization, but by a group of people in the organization that perhaps sit at different places in the organization, from people who are actually working in the community front lines to people who are making decisions, because then they actually come together and have to come to some consensus about what they think their capacity is to perform that one function, right? And then you get that information back, and then you can aggregate that. So that's how we've done it in the past. Sense of community and connections within groups of people and among groups of people in a place are also useful measures. The sense of community index is one measure. There are definitely other measures out there to assess connections, but it's important to not only think about that strength of that sense of community within a group of people, but between two groups of people that may have to interact with each other in common places, but otherwise may not actually see each other as allies, right? And so again, measuring that sense of community within and between is really helpful. Conflicts and setbacks are not necessarily negative outcomes or failures. And I think this is something really important to remember. Again, conflict transformation is a really key capacity in place-based change. It's not a capacity that we see often. It's also a capacity we see that because it's not there, it sometimes creates, it causes the work to slow down, right? And then setbacks are not necessarily bad things. I think funders like to measure things like, did a policy change or did it not change? And I remember a story where a funder said, well, we failed because that policy didn't get passed. But what happened was a whole network of relationships were established. They were mobilized to push for that policy. And those relationships will stay and they can be mobilized again for the next challenge. And so just think about how we frame these conflicts and setbacks sometimes. I think with that, we're at the end. I'm going to ask Amber and Corinne just if you have anything you want to add to what I said.
I was going to bridge because there's a good question saying, what's the difference? Like we've mentioned power and community building and community organizing. So how do you approach program evaluation that's different than community organizing in the context of maybe traditional program development, like in government and university programs? I think there's like, how do you be an agent of change in different contexts is maybe how I hear that. So I just wanted to lift that up since you're kind of jamming on those findings.
Yeah. Do you want me to answer that?
I think your work, Orianne, I think it was directly related after you presented your story, Ken, that one came up. And there's another one about the ripple effects. And while you're thinking, I don't mind sharing, like some of the questions that we asked folks is, what were some of the experiences and changes that happened during the program experience, and kept it really like, how was it interacting with your friends? Did it feel different, or people interacting different with you? Are you being invited to different spaces or new connections? And then asking like, what was unexpected, right? And then really with the failure conflict, what's good is acknowledging that and say, how would you do things differently? Or what was the unexpected that really opened doors because it wasn't the way maybe you thought? And then the most important piece was then after they interviewed each other at the table, what was similar and different across your journeys trying to change different points of access or awareness on a topic in your community? And then see if there's any ahas or build upon each other. So it's not only data collection, and it's the theme we've been hearing, it's community building and using evaluation as a form of building community to see the change you're already doing is another continuous, I think Orianne was calling it that just-in-time feedback. And so how do you put that in as you go? So that there was a question on that. So I just wanted to answer that question.
Thanks, Amber. And I'll come back to the question about how is evaluating the community organizing context different. But before I do that, I guess, Corinne, do you have anything to add? I see you're busy typing answers as well to questions.
No, I mean, the only thing that jumped into my mind while you were kind of summarizing the takeaways, Kian, was just how important that the idea of like building towards something is that just that progress is an outcome. Any kind of progress is an outcome. And it relates to other work I've done on place-based investments, and finding like, lo and behold, place-based investments that build on top of each other can actually amplify change over time, as opposed to thinking of it in a negative light. Why does a place continue to need targeted investment? But instead actually seeing that as an indicator of strength and progress, that one investment was able to help a community advance a few steps, and really lay groundwork for more progress and advancement. So I appreciate you saying that. It resonates.
Thank you. So to answer that question about how is, evaluating place, the community organizing as a major feature, how is that different? I think what we found is that it's the evaluating, understanding the how and not necessarily the what. And so in the kind of in this one place-based change work that we evaluated, I mean, we had to look at the relationships and the who had connections to whom and who had the power, who were the decision makers in this place. And what you want to see over time is a shift, right, from the power being held by, a family, sometimes when you're in a rural town, or to, elected officials only. And it's how do you shift that to the community? How do you shift that to community leaders who can then speak for their community members and be able to drive change that actually speaks directly to the needs of their community members. A colleague of ours, David Chavez, often says this about evaluating kind of community organizing work, place-based change, or power building work. Is about, at the end, who gets what they want. And that's what we want to see. We want to see that, the people who have no access to resources and opportunities at the end of a strategy get what they want, so that they can thrive and live to their full potential. And so really it's about assessing those relationships, those connections, where decision makes, how are decisions made, and at the end of the day, what changes. I was just thinking about Korean's story, and then the story I told, like the story A was like in the beginning of a strategy, people like coming together, identifying common concerns, just getting to know one another, not seeing each other as enemies, and shifting the narratives about each other. And then over the years, and Korean said it took 5 years for that story to unfold in her situation. Over time, as you develop the voice to advocate for change together, you build on it. And that success of feeling like our collective action, despite our perceived differences, can actually lead to change that benefits all of us, right? And so then, you get 5 years later, you get the tiny homes, you get a policy change that allows for that. So I think it's sort of how do you track that story over time, and how do you monitor the shifts over time from relationship changes to narrative changes to actual policy changes that benefit everybody. And it's really about connecting those dots.
We have a lot of energy around community organizing. I think you started saying about the time difference, and also folks saying like, sometimes funders don't pay for evaluation. So how do you overcome this gap that maybe you need to tell your story? I'm guessing is in the tea leaves of that comment. I was quickly reading the third one. I couldn't read it fast enough and say it at the same time, but those were a couple that were out there. I don't know.
Learning. I mean, they don't fund evaluation, but they fund learning. I think we've seen that. I don't know, the two of you probably have seen that too.
Yeah.
I've seen it. Corian, tell me what you think is I've seen like how do we learn, or how do we do real-time strategy adjustments, which for us at community science, strategy and evaluation are at the same starting line. So I think that could be another way to like strategy refinement or continuous learning. I think the other thing, Corian, I'm curious what you have to say, is I've heard learning agendas, right? And then when folks ask for a learning agenda, again, that's another way to get data to tell the stories that you've heard.
Yeah, I think most funders are interested in proving that their investments matter, and so their evaluation is one important way to to get to that story. But yeah, just to really reiterate what Kian and Amber have already said about other ways of partnering with funders to show them the benefit of understanding their goals, developing a measurement framework to capture progress over time, and circling back regularly to track progress. Um, we might call that evaluation in some contexts, and then in other contexts, yeah, it's really a learning process, and giving them the ability to tell the stories of what their investments have helped communities achieve.
Thank you. I would agree. And I think time's up because it was 45 minutes and I want to respect everybody's time. I know there are 2 questions still open in the Q&A chat, but we will definitely do our best to answer these questions separately, and we will be sending out a post-webinar package with our information on it, our emails and stuff. And so if you all have any questions or any additional information you want, please feel free to write any of us. Thank you so much for listening in the afternoon of Monday afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you are. We really appreciate your time, and have a wonderful day.